in the Shade of the Qur'an, Volume 30, by Sayyid Qutb, and translated beautifully by M.A. Salahi and A.A.Shamis for the World Assembly of Muslim Youth. We start today with an introduction about this book. Ever since its revelation 40,000 years ago, the Quran has been a book of guidance, a constitution for daily affairs, and a rich source of social dynamism for the hundreds or millions of people who believe it to be the immutable word of God. Hardly a generation passed without a fresh attempt to unravel the Quran's meaning and interpret its message within the contemporary perspective. In the Shade of the Quran is more than just another commentary, yet it is not too overreaching or too outlandish to be a completely new interpretation. It is a serious, sincere, and sober effort to understand man's contemporary achievements and difficulties in the light of the Quran's message, on one hand, and to vigorously explore and expand its guidance for an increasingly sophisticated and highly perplexed human society on the other hand. The work, which is Sayyid's largest and most important, spans the whole of the text of the Quran and was written and partly rewritten over a period of more than 15 years, most of which the author spent in prison. It is a work in which is embedded Sayyid's insight and his highly esteemed intellectual vigor and his widely acclaimed literary prowess. It has been widely recognized as an outstanding contribution to Islamic thought and scholarship, to which students and scholars, as well as contemporary Islamic revivalist movement all over the world, owe a great deal. Now that it is available in English, it will continue to educate and inspire millions more and take its place as an indispensable work of reference for a proper understanding of 20th century Islamic thinking. Sayyid Qutb is a foremost Muslim thinker of the latter half of this century. Born in 1906, he came from a deeply religious Egyptian background. He started his career as a literary man and progressed to become one of the most original thinkers of the contemporary Islamic movement. He wrote with a profound sense of conviction, which led him to give his life for his belief when he was executed in August 1966 by the Nasser regime of Egypt. He wrote more than 25 books, of which this is the largest and the most important. In this slot, we start with his brother's preface. We start with his brother's introduction by Professor Muhammad Qutb of King Abdul Aziz University, Mecca, Saudi Arabia. It gives me great pleasure to write this introduction to In the Shade of the Quran in its English version. The book is the fruit of the most productive years of its author's intellectual life, and at the same time a vivid expression of the sacred battle which he fought and which culminated in his martyrdom in 1966. The larger part of this work was written when the author was in jail in the period of 1954 to 1964. This was a period of complete solitude when writing was the main preoccupation of the author, and during which he lived totally in the shade of the Quran. The author's vigorous struggle, for which he was imprisoned, Tanqil was at the practical level an attempt to achieve the implementation of Islam in the shape of a community which practices Islam in its life and preaches the need of its realization until it becomes the actual code of practice for the society as a whole. At the intellectual level, however, the author's life struggle is embodied in a collection of books devoted to explaining the true nature of Islam, its fundamentals, values and laws. The largest and most important of this work is undoubtedly In the Shade of the Qur'an. The book is a campaign of struggle because it is indeed much more than a commentary on the Qur'an. The Qur'an is the book of Islam. Hardly a generation has passed since the dawn of Islam without the appearance of one or more commentaries which explain the meaning of the Qur'an. Having spent a considerable part of his life in the shade of the Qur'an and having joined the struggle for the sake of Islam, the author of this work did not intend to write just another commentary. He had a different objective which he felt could be attained through writing his commentary. Our present age has its own features which perhaps have never existed in any period of history. They are the ones which give this commentary its own coloring and determine its points of emphasis. The Muslims, for their part, are now far removed and their practical life from the true nature of Islam. The image of Islam they present by their way of life is nothing more than the indistinguishable negative of the true image of Islam as it was practiced by the early Islamic generation, who perfectly fulfill Allah's own description of them. You are indeed the best nation that has ever raised up for mankind. You enjoin the doing of what is right and forbid the doing of what is wrong, and you believe in Allah. Hence, they were able to write that incomparable page in human history. They established truth and justice on earth and raised for mankind an inimitable civilization which builds up its structures in the material and spiritual worlds at the same time. It is a civilization which unites the two worlds and achieves harmony between body and soul, religion and politics, faith and science, the present life and the hereafter, the practical and the ideal. The non-Muslim, on the other hand, confronts humanity with a host of philosophical, social, political, and economic doctrines which banish religion from practical life and at best restrict it to a tiny corner of man's conscience, so that it may become purely a relationship between the individual and his Lord that has no bearing whatsoever on society and its active life, or at worst fight it tooth and nail and bar its very existence. As a result, human life is full of many sorts of political, social, and economic injustice which know no limit. It witnesses various types of intellectual and moral perversion unknown in history. The advocates of such perversion and deviation try nevertheless to dress their erring ways in a scientific garment, and they hold to them as if they were truth itself or the ideal sought after. This they do despite all that they suffer in consequence of nervous and psychological diseases, worry and restlessness, madness and suicide, alcoholism, drug addiction and crime. What is worse is that these deviant philosophical, social, political and economic doctrines now dominate the lives of contemporary Muslims, wearing the false disguise of a modern human civilization. Thus, they poison the life of the Muslim people to a larger degree than they do the life of the West, because the Muslims of today have deserted Islam and are unaware of its true nature and fundamental value. Hence, the The vigorous intellectual and practical campaign of struggle to which the author devoted himself was an attempt to explain to contemporary Muslims the true nature of Islam. His driving objective was that the Muslims of today should be able to live and practice true Islam in the same way as the early Islamic generation. They would then rescue themselves and would be able to show all mankind the road to salvation. The Quran is the constitution revealed by Allah to regulate and govern human life. This is the book which educated the Islamic nation until it attained the standard which earned it the title the best nation ever raised up for mankind. Light should therefore be thrown on it from two angles. The first is the angle of education. This shows how the Quran at the level of the individual, the family, the community and the nation leads man to achieve the highest degree of moral and spiritual nobility possible in this life. The other angle is that of the practical code which regulates human life in its noblest form and in all its spheres: political, economic, social, intellectual, and moral. That is, a life which is befitting to man whom Allah has ennobled and raised above all species of his creation and entrusted with the task of the heaven, the earth, and the mountains, have all dreaded to shoulder. This is the method the author has followed in explaining the meaning of the Quran. It does not dwell long on individual words or expressions, unless there is a special need for that. Rather, it takes the whole verse or a number of verses and explains their relevance to the education of men according to the divine method, or to the practical codes which regulate the life of Islamic society in all spheres. Faith is the central point of Islamic education and the Islamic practical code. It takes up the larger part of the Quran and its surah. Consequently, it takes up the larger part in the shade of the Quran. As presented by the Quran, faith is not merely a word to be uttered and then forgotten as man goes about his diverse practical affairs. It learns of the significance of faith and its control. Faith is indeed a pivot around which all life turns. The conscience, the intellect, and the practical sense all alike. The belief in the unity of Allah goes deep into the very structure of the universe as well as into the human self. It provides a complete conception of life and human existence which differs greatly in fundamental and in detail from any concept which is not based on the same essential fact. The believer in whose heart this fundamental fact is firmly established finds that his feeling, ideas, and concepts, as well as his private and social actions, are totally different from those of a man who conducts his life affairs on a different basis or who views faith as an abstract, philosophical idea which has little or no influence on his life. The same applies to the community whose life is governed by faith. His aim, ambitions, behavior, and practical achievements are different from those of any other community which does not share its Islamic concept of God, the universe, life, and man. The Quran projects this image in full detail. The image of the believer as his soul is molded by the acceptance of the reality of the unity of Allah, in contrast with the erring soul who does not submit to this cardinal truth, and the image of the faithful community which conducts his life on the basis that there is no deity but Allah, in contrast with the erring communities which adopt different doctrines and ignoble values. Through this project, the Quran educates the individual believers and the community of believers so that they may attain their highest standard. It then provides them with the practical code which regulates the various aspects of life and establishes the best nation ever raised up for mankind. The author actually leaves with the Quran as it projects these images. He then tries to show his readers the image of a believer content with his faith, delineating the feelings, ideas, values, concepts, as well as the practical conduct of the believer as described in the Quran. He also tries to explain the practical code Allah has laid down for human life. This is indeed the basic theme of this work in the shade of the Quran. It dwells at length on faith and how it penetrates the human self, as well as on its influence on the various aspects of life, especially in the area of the implementation of divine legislation. There are two reasons for this. The first is that the Quran itself dwells for long on introduction on all these aspects. It describes how faith leaves its mark on all human action, in all situation and condition, in security or fear, in ease or hardship, in wealth or poverty, in society or solitude, in peace or war, in strength or weakness, in resisting personal desires or struggling against the enemies. The Quran also repeatedly declares in clear terms that accepting the faith means submission to the divine laws and the rejection of all other laws. Failing that submission, the declaration of faith by any person becomes a hollow statement with no real substance and unacceptable to Allah. The other reason is that these very implications are the ones that have been forgotten by or are completely unknown to the Muslims of today. This applies most particularly in the case of submission to the divine law as an essential part of faith, without which one's faith is incomplete and faulty. Or unless the divine law is upheld, the true image of Islam remains non-existent at both the individual and the societal and the social level. The author also speaks at length on the numerous signs in the universe which indicate the divine existence, making occasional but cautious use of some of the conclusions arrived at by modern science. This he does because the Quran often dwells on those signs, since they are sure to stimulate the human heart to conscious recognition of the unity of the Creator and His infinite majesty and greatness, and consequently to worship and submit to Him alone. He also described scenes of the hereafter, because the Quran paints this in great detail, as they are important means to awaken the religious conscience of man and to establish a dual relationship with Allah and man, based on the two strongest and parallel feelings in man, namely fear and hope. He also dwells a great deal on the various Islamic systems in their basic unchangeable principle, as opposed to the multitude of deviant and ignorant systems which rule the earth today. His aim here is to show how wide the gulf is between the rule of Allah and that of ignorance, and to explain the serious consequence of man's refusal to comply with the divine instruction, his obstinate disregard of his wisdom, and his spurning of divine revelation, claiming at the same time that he knows his need and can judge what is most suitable for him better than Allah. The author also speaks comprehensively on the Islamic method of educating the individual and the community, with the dual purpose of shedding light on the Quranic instruction on the one hand, and the other enriching the contemporary Islamic revivalist movement in this field. This enrichment is badly needed at this particular stage, as the Islamic movement strives to establish an Islamic presence in the midst of ignorant surroundings which are hostile to Islam, trying to suppress it or at least to move away from it. In this area, the author lays strong emphasis on education through events, to delineate the Quranic method of making use of great events in disciplining the human soul, so that it may be molded in the required shape while it is still vividly impressed by the event. Thus, it takes the right mold permanently and becomes immune to deviation. If one reads the Quran in a sort of a passive, detached state, one is sure to miss a lot of its indication and purposes. But when one reads it while actually involved in the cause trying to establish that there is no deity but Allah, one's heart will open to receive its meaning, which one would otherwise have missed, and it will draw inferences of which one was totally unaware. The present work is itself a proof of this fact. The author wrote the earlier edition of a number of volumes before he engaged in the real battle, when he had not yet devoted himself fully to the campaign of no deity but Allah. Then he rewrote the earlier volumes from within. The difference between the two editions cannot be exaggerated. It is a difference produced by the new light shade by actually practicing the meaning of the Quran. Another arresting feature of this commentary, in its Arabic original at least, is its literary style. The author started his life as a man of letters, preoccupied with the artistic side of his life. His attitude to life and to the universe was that of a keen artist who has a lively and genuine response to whatever is beautiful and who goes through practical life with an idealistic outlook. This, however, did not prevent him from becoming involved in the political issues of the day. The latter part of his life, on the other hand, was devoted to his vigorous struggle for the cause that has become his sole preoccupation. To the cause of Islam he devoted his thought and his feelings, his night and his days, and indeed his whole life. But did he ever lose his artistic feeling, which was so prominent in his earlier career? Indeed not. The Quran itself, in whose shade the author has lived, is characterized by a fine style of surpassing excellence, even as it portrays the ongoing battles of no deity but Allah. I extend my greeting to the readers of this English translation, hoping that they will live with the author in the shade of the Quran. Professor Muhammad Qutb, Professor of Islamic Studies, King Abdul Aziz, Mecca, Saudi Arabia. Subhanallah, walhamdulillah, wa la ilaha illallah, wallahu akbar, wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billahil aliyyil azim, wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billahil aliyyil azim, wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billahil aliyyil azim.